Okay, so
Hello.
now we're here to do the 2022 paper, so the second of the past papers. And Peter's giving me the hospital pass of War of the Austrians. So which of the following had a greater
Because
impact? Yeah,
I like to see James lose.
yeah. I have had proper sleep this time, but I don't even think with proper sleep you can get rid of this one. But which of the following had a greater impact on the strength of Britain's position in America, the War of Austrian Succession or the Seven Years' War? So, um, I suppose the War of Austrian Succession. Maybe you could argue that the impact of it and them losing, but that them having some success in Louisburg, because they did manage to get some success, that kind of gave the colonies a sense of like victory and purpose because they were able to defeat the French. So you could argue that that gave them a little momentum. And then the fact that it was handed back by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle also built up some resentment because I think the colonists felt that they had died taking something that they then had to hand back. But you could also argue that in that war, Britain's biggest successes were in North America. They gave it back because they traded it for European land, as the main focus was in Europe. And possibly that could be where the inspiration came for Pitt to make the 7 Years' War focus North America because they'd had some success there, and ultimately, even though this at the end of the War of Austrian Succession, the British position was still the same, you could argue that being the same was better than losing their position that they did in the 7 Years' War afterwards, because the end of the 7 Years' War kind of ended up with a catalyst of them losing North America, despite them winning the war. And like, I think also maybe the settlers moving into the Ohio Valley after the War of Austrian Succession kind of set the battlegrounds for the westward expansion. And without that, there wouldn't have been the Proclamation Act. And without the Proclamation Act, there might be no need to put an army on the western border of the Appalachians to stop them from going west. And without the need for an army, they might not have needed to tax after the stamp tax. So you could argue that even though it looks like the end of the situation was a draw, the War of Austrian Succession kind of laid the groundwork for what would come afterwards that would lead to the Americans pushing for independence. That's my sole route there, I
That's
think.
your take.
Yeah,
Okay. I
make
mean,
the
I think that a catalyst argument might work for the War of Austrian Succession.
yeah. It's the only option
Um,
I've got again.
my if I was going to take that side, I would probably say something like the fact that it was fairly indecisive meant that it set the stage then for the conclusions of the 7 Years' War.
Yeah.
But I think would you agree, James? I think it's much easier to take the 7 Years' War. That's why I
Yep.
chose it, to see you
Yes, yes.
squirm.
I did my best. I think I did an all right job with War of Austrian Succession. They've still got to say
Yeah,
the word significant, even if they don't choose it. I
yeah.
think
I mean,
because it says on the impact on the strength of Britain's position, the greater impact. So I suppose it depends how you want to interpret that, because you could say
correct.
the 7 Years' War had the greatest impact, but it was a negative impact in the end because it led to the independence of the colonies, whereas the War of Austrian Successions wasn't as strong, but that it didn't lead to them losing their strength. So it depends how I guess you frame that.
I guess that's right. If you're going to interpret strength in a fairly straightforward manner, then you would say that the 7 Years' War is obviously more important. But
Yeah, I
if you're
think
going to
that's
say
the most obvious way to impact the question.
that's the most obvious, but if you're going to kind of do a kind of interpretive jiu-jitsu move or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah,
you could say that the strength of Britain's position is ultimately compromised by the fact of British supremacy for that intervening period. But
yeah,
fine,
and the loss
I'm
of
going to take. James, I'm a very literal person, so I'm just going to take the literal.
well, yeah, we're not usually you're the more ideological person, but yeah, go on, off you go. I mean, yours is the easy side. Go and knock it out.
So, um, the basic fact is that the War of Austrian Succession is inconclusive. And although the British make some gains in King George's War of Austrian Succession, they lose them in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, right? Most of them. The other thing is that to refute the first claim, it it's the British just don't have a lot of success. So they're badly directed. They don't have William Pitt yet. Who can really, he's a personality that makes a big difference. They don't have very good coordination between the colonists and the regular military. So even though they do try to colonize the Ohio Valley, it's actually a failure, right? The French managed to fortify the Ohio Valley. The British are defeated. The French are much more successful at using Indian cooperation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not, so from the point of view of British strength in America, that's not great. On the other hand, in the 7 Years' War, the British really managed to turn things around, and I want to just mention, I guess, 3 factors.
Yeah, because it's
James,
3 they have to put in. They ideally want
in this
three
in
points.
this argument.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first is British naval superiority.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd point to the success at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, 1759. And the important implication of this battle is that the British are able to prevent the French from resupplying their colonies. And so it's not, when you're fighting a war, it's not just about, killing people and fighting. It's also about logistics and supplies. Arguably, it's mostly about logistics and supplies. If you don't have enough supplies, you have no war. And so the fact that the British Navy is able to successfully prevent the French from resupplying is one major factor. And they didn't have that in the War of the Austrian Succession to anywhere near the same extent. The second one are massive territorial gains in the 7 Years' War. Florida, Quebec, Montreal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they actually expand their territorial gains hugely, and that's cemented in the Treaty of Paris.
Everything east of the Mississippi, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And then the third one, I guess, goes into the Treaty of Paris. They're able to conclude the treaty with massive British gains. And looking at the British sort of geopolitical position more generally, Britain now has most of North America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not all of it, but most of it. It's got control of the seas. It's got the Caribbean. So they traded Guadeloupe. So during the 7 Years' War, there's a French island, Guadeloupe, right? Which the British took from the French. They traded it back for the Quebec.
Yeah, they had a choice between taking Canada or taking the Caribbean.
Yeah, in fact, and that, so the British position was so good that they basically didn't want to take too much for fear that the French would then go to war with them again later on, I think. So that kind of.
Yeah, I think they had to, because their main target was North America as well.
Good dilemma to have.
Yeah, obviously the elimination of the French
is
massive. They have total control of the territory. Fundamentally, that means that then the colonists no longer have to fear the French, so they end up turning their attention on the British.
Precisely, yeah. So you anticipated, James, my final point, and this is this is kind of bitter, slightly bitter taste, to an otherwise sweet victory, which is, in fact, the British are so successful that the French really have not much prospect of ever recovering, at least in North America. And from the point of view of the colonists, they actually become less dependent on the British, on British protection, because, well, there's not really a threat of a war and of French, some kind of French military victory, which would actually threaten the colonies on the East Coast.
Yep. And the westward expansion clashes lead to the Proclamation Act, and the need for taxation to pay for the army leads to the Stamp Act, and as we know, that's the accelerator into the other problems.
Right. And as so often, success success is dangerous. Too much success is dangerous.
But I think it's quite clear the 7 Years' War had a bigger impact on the strength, even though I had to argue war succession. I think
it is too. And I think, you know, it's I guess these questions, some of them have much easier options, right? They give you two options.
They've just got to come up with
two options, but they give you two options.
Points of significance for each one. That's the problem if you get a really weird one. But then it's the counter argument. It's the why one more than the other one.
Yeah. Is that okay, James? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think the war. I think the 7 Years' War obviously had a greater impact because it wiped out the French and it gave them hegemony over the continent, at least until the colonists fought for independence. Whereas I think the War of Austrian Succession effectively ended in a stalemate.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. So then we can go into the essay. So, to what extent was American unity the reason for the British defeat in the American Revolution, 1774 to 1783? I'll set this up. Is in this one. I would say the obvious three factors are, because this is basically like the American strength, British weakness, like external.
It's a variation, right?
Yeah, it's done. So of course, the natural thing is you'd look at it and go, oh, it's not American strength. So if you wrote with American strength, you'd be in trouble. It's American unity. But the obvious replacement, and when you're looking at these factors, you would be like, well, what factor can I replace? Obviously, American strength in this case would be replaced by American unity. And the external factors and British weakness, you can have the same as you normally do.
Yeah.
That's your three factors. I think they're the obvious three, no?
I guess so. I mean, can I tell you my take?
Yeah, go on. How would you break it to three?
I'd say, so I guess I'd say that it was American unity is a condition for victory, but it's not the only condition. Maybe not even the decisive one. So my first point would be that American unity is a condition for the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. So if you had disagreements, and let's just say New York, right, decided not to go to do the Continental Congress, it was a bit more like Rhode Island or something, then I think.
Can I just jump in there? Because obviously, of course, work on this. That was a legit concern for New York and Pennsylvania. They were not, no one liked Massachusetts and no one wanted to support them. And they made Virginia joining conditional upon them supporting Massachusetts. They wouldn't have done it. Like the other big colonies, New York and Pennsylvania, wouldn't have come in without Virginia. So that is important. That unity coming together, it was significant because it wouldn't happen.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a condition, right? It doesn't mean victory, but it provides you the basis for victory, assuming other positive factors. And of course, if you're going to be really clever, you would say, well, what does unity even mean? Because obviously there's quite a lot of loyalists in all of there are
well, that would be a counter argument against this. You could say actually a lot of people were still on the British side, a lot of them were still loyalists, so therefore there wasn't as much unity.
And there were people who were just on the fence. Yeah. So, but I think that the fact that in terms of the government, the colonial governments were unified enough that they could they could basically put an army on the field.
Yeah, especially in the second Congress.
And at least in theory, pay for it. So unity is a condition for that. But on the other hand, so that's to a moderate extent. But on the other hand, I think you could say Washington's personal leadership is maybe just as decisive.
But you could put that inside it now, because his leadership is what allowed the unity to. His greatest achievement was keeping the unity together.
Well, I mean, he only had about at the lowest point 1,500 dudes on the
field. He kept them in the field. You know what I mean? And he
kept them in the field.
And I think his counterattacks in Trenton, allowed that moral victory allowed the unity when there was a moment of possible fracture.
Yeah, but don't steal my thunder. I'm I'll
let you do the whole
doing my performance on the stage, and you're chipping in. Okay, so in against the thesis that it's just American unity. So this is to an extent question, right? So I'd say to some extent, to a moderate extent. But the reason why it's not completely the reason is there are other decisive factors, and there are two other decisive factors I would mention. The first is the French intervention in the war, in the latter part of the War of Independence. that, well, it drained the British strength. So, and it also prevented reinforcements at the decisive moment, and that's the kind of that weird freak event that the French Navy actually prevent the British from reinforcing in the battle. I've just forgotten the name of the battle. This is with the surrender of Cornwallis in Virginia, West Virginia.
At Yorktown.
Yorktown, sorry, that's it. Yeah, Yorktown. So that's important, very important. And the second is British strategic failures. I think that British leadership is inconsistent at best. I think that if they'd followed up on their early victories in New York against Washington, perhaps they could have changed the balance. And I think they were just, they just took too much champagne with them. Our good friend Burgoyne. He was just, he had wagons of champagne. That kind of slowed him down a bit. Maybe if he just taken a few less carriages of champagne.
I think the piano is the bit that tips over the edge for me.
Oh yeah, and the piano. Why? Yeah, you just need. I mean, piano's good for morale. So is champagne.
Does it work in the forest in the winter? I don't know. Doesn't it get rotted by rain? All right, let me add to those points, and then we'll debate about which one's most significant. So, American unity, I think Washington's leadership keeps them united. But even in that point, that's why I think unity is not the same as American strength, and that's why I think it's a weaker factor. You know what I mean? I think if you're going American strength, you could do it, but American unity itself, I think it's harder because they were not really united. I mean, the southern colonies weren't even going to come on board until Britain threatened to offered to free the slaves, basically turned it around. There was a lot of loyalists, especially in the Carolinas and in Georgia, where there were effectively civil wars in the South. Colonies were reluctant to join Massachusetts. They still couldn't taxation was contributions financially were still voluntary. Some contributed more than others. Definitely some states were doing more heavy lifting than others in terms of what was going on. And even in terms of military leadership, after Saratoga, Gates wanted to take the leadership of the Continental Army off Washington. Without the counterattack in Trenton, he may well have lost it. So even at the military command level, there was disunity. And Benedict Arnold tried to sell West Point out to the British after being a celebrated leader. So I think
too, the snitch.
Yeah. So I think that it's so an oversimplification to say there was full-on unity. I don't think there was. I think Washington and the Continental Congress managed to keep enough unity in the American army to keep them in the field. But I don't think it was the reason why they won.
It sounds like the kind of thing you might say if you're let's just say a not very switched on politician giving some lame speech on American history to, I don't know, a bunch of American school kids or something.
Yeah.
That there might be ideological reasons to say it was our unity as a country and our spirit and our belief in
that's how Americans
in ourselves. I know that's how America. So that thesis might be tempting from a certain point of view, but I don't think it's very
but this is why it's key, because
obviously
we've got the essay pack prepared with American strength, but this is not American strength, this is American unity. And when the factor changes slightly, it's not the full range of lots of things they did, like training the army, and that is irrelevant to this question because that's not really showing unity. So, and it's the key bit for the students is to make sure they're aware that when they have to do a shift in an essay, that can shift their overall answer as well, because it's not exactly the same, and they need to be laser focused on the question. Yeah. So, and I think that if you're looking at the leadership of Washington, if you're looking at the weaknesses in terms of external factors, yes, the French came in, they won, they helped them with Yorktown. I think most importantly, they raised finances and they raised ships' weapons for them as well. They supplied a navy, which kind of meant the British Navy didn't have total dominance. And more importantly, because Spain and Holland, the British Navy was designed to be bigger than the second and third biggest navies in the world. Well, they didn't anticipate the whole of the world at the same time. At this point, you had France, Spain, and the Netherlands, which is the second, third, and fourth biggest navies in the world, and they couldn't really handle that. And then
Can I be devil's advocate for a second though, and say that
yeah, go on. And then yeah.
yeah, well, what about the will to fight,
Yeah.
like the will to press on? Isn't that, can't you relate that to the unity
Yeah, I think that comes under
thing pretty
Washington.
well?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, they had to just
so
survive.
there is a relationship between unity and strength in the sense that you need the, there's lots of examples of having the material, the troop numbers to fight, but not having the will to do it.
Yes, but they have to make that
Um,
specific link. If they don't,
yeah,
yeah, as long as you make the link, it's fine. But they would need to
sure.
specifically say yeah, you could. I think, yeah. I mean, American survival was what won the war. They just had to wait out the British. And obviously the French coming in threatened the Caribbean, which was much more lucrative to the British at this point than North America was. I would say they were more likely to protect it. But I think the weakness of the British, I mean, I think the weakness of the British was fundamentally there. I think, yeah, you can talk about Burgoyne and his failure in like Saratoga, Cornwallis's bad decision to get trapped and pinned in Yorktown, Howe's failure to aid either of them, Howe's failure to capture Washington when he fled from Long Island. I think these are all fundamental strategic errors. But at the end of the day, with the possible exception of Howe capturing Washington, because that may have tipped the war, I don't, again, because like, okay, say Burgoyne is successful, he gets down, he captures Boston. I don't think that would have made any difference. It didn't make any difference when they captured Philadelphia. They'd have just rolled it, they'd have just gone into guerrilla warfare in the countryside in the same way. Same if like, what
Yeah.
exactly was
It,
Cornwallis attempting to capture? I mean, they've captured
it,
Philadelphia and it made no difference. What was it
it's
going to
very tricky. It's very
Yeah.
tricky. I think if they'd got Philadelphia much quicker and hadn't delayed, then
You
maybe
mean
that
and
could have.
actually captured the
Yeah, I think
Congress
that
there?
I think that could have made a difference. But all things being equal, it
Yeah,
wasn't. I
they were
mean,
quite cautious, which is like, but I think that fundamentally British weakness, the big British weakness was the underlying weakness. They have to beat an army and they have to beat an enemy that doesn't see conventional defeat as defeat.
yeah, and the other problem is, of course, that what does victory and defeat even mean
Yeah,
when you want to you don't want to totally destroy your enemy. I mean,
yeah,
the British don't want to completely wipe out the their colonists because they're
yeah,
basically British,
yeah,
right? So they actually need to win a victory where they're not just going to have to fight a series of future wars. They have to
yeah.
somehow win I hate to say this hackneyed phrase, but the hearts and minds. And so there's a strange paradox, isn't there, in
Sure.
the British position,
Yeah,
that they're fighting a war on the one hand, but they also don't want to get the Americans too offside on the other.
yeah. And
It's a kind of
I'm saying that like,
weird tension to have to navigate. Maybe that tension explains to some extent either the lack of leadership or the lack of resolve on the British side.
yeah, and they've got like a large territory to cover with a very small army to cover it. The naval superiority is enormous, but the Americans just move away from the coast. It's not really a problem. They offer to free the slaves, which means they lose any chance of the South coming on their side as loyalists. Um, they they are not despotically brutal enough to put them down, but I'm not even sure that would have worked. I think that fundamentally you're directing a war from very far away. I think there was a certain inevitability to American independence. And of these three factors, I would go British weakness, but like that because
Yeah,
in the underlying nature, they had a fundamental weakness to run with, and then they exacerbate it through their own incompetence.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I agree
Yeah,
with that. I think that even with the French intervention,
yeah,
um, if the British were had been a bit more steadfast,
yeah.
which is unusual because the British are very steadfast in many respects, in many other examples.
But I think the
Um,
French
so
intervention only accelerated the end game. I think
yeah,
to where it
right.
was going anyway.
Anyway, okay, all right. So
And I think
I
that's the
think we've got,
fundamental difference between the wording being American unity and American strength. Because if it was American strength, I would go with American strength because of their whole setup and situation. But American unity doesn't allow that because American unity doesn't take into account the geographical advantages or other stuff because that's not unity. If that makes
yeah.
sense. So I think that's
Yeah.
where fundamentally now I would, if it was a pure American strength question, I'd probably go American strength. But when it's American unity, which is a more narrower focus, it would then pivot me back to British weakness, because British weakness takes into account all those territorial things that would be in the American strength one, but aren't in the American unity essay. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Are you also leaning towards British weakness?
Well, yeah, as I said, I think that American unity is a condition for success,
Yeah,
but it's not the only or even the decisive condition. So without American unity, you can't have a war of independence.
yeah,
But you have to have more than simply unity to be able to win it.
yeah,
And the factors I think we both agree on is really, number one, British weakness,
yeah,
British failure, and then French intervention or foreign intervention as a kind of aggregating factor.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But British weakness is
Well,
the underlying factor, and that's why it's the more important one. All right, cool. We can stop there.
that's a wrap.
Yeah, we'll wrap that.